Well, BC's credit rating has been downgraded again. The official opposition says it signals to investors that the province is going broke.
In BC, because it's sending a very negative signal that taxes are going to have to be significantly higher in the future to stabilise the province's fiscal situation.
British Columbia is staring at a financial breakdown few Canadians thought possible. The province is running a record $13.3 billion deficit, with another $12 billion and $11 billion expected after that. Debt and interest costs are exploding, taxes are rising, and the government has no credible recovery plan. Ottawa and Mark Carney can no longer pretend this is under control.
It's like the province has been on a big holiday, racked up an enormous credit card bill, and we've come home and realised, wow, we don't have the income to actually pay the bill. It's going to take years to get out of this.
The BC government wants people to treat this as another difficult budget year, but the numbers tell a much uglier story. The province is not dealing with one unexpected expense or a short recession. It is running massive deficits year after year while economic growth remains weak. Even worse, analysts warn that these deficits could be revised upward as interest costs continue growing and the government keeps borrowing to cover the gap.
BC's business community is also reacting. Jairo Eunice with BC Business Council says the province's credit rating has declined quickly since 2021. He says the drop suggests the province is riskier for investors.
David Eby's government owns this mess. BC entered this period with far stronger finances, yet the province moved from a deficit of roughly $9 billion to around $13 billion in a single budget cycle. That is a jump of about $4 billion. Officials had already suggested there would be no major increase in the deficit and no large new tax burden. Then the budget arrived and exposed those assurances as political theater.
What we expected wasn't what we got, though. Indeed, there are record deficits ahead, a ballooning debt, additional taxes, delays on capital projects, and a rather tepid set of cuts. And nowhere to be found was a prosperity or productivity plan.
The Greater Vancouver Board of Trade gave the budget a D, and even that sounds generous. Business leaders have said BC does not have a revenue problem. It has a spending problem. Yet Eby's government keeps calling this discipline. Apparently, discipline now means spending more than the province earns, raising taxes, delaying projects, and leaving the next generation with the bill. Victoria has turned fiscal irresponsibility into official policy.
Well, I've been saying for a number of years that when you're running your finances like this, it's a very negative signal to people about whether to base and build their lives in British Columbia, and to businesses about whether to build your operations.
Mark Carney and the federal government cannot pretend this is only a provincial issue. Ottawa has spent years encouraging the same model. Larger government, higher spending, more borrowing, and the belief that future economic growth will somehow rescue every bad decision. Carney now talks about national investment, trade diversification, and major projects, but one of Canada's largest provinces is becoming less competitive while drowning in debt.
I could not give it a C-. It was a worse budget than in previous years, and I knew that our members were going to have serious concerns, not only about new taxes, but also the trajectory of the fiscal situation of the province.
Ottawa should have been demanding a credible recovery plan from BC. Instead, the federal government keeps supporting the same political culture that created this crisis. Carney wants Canadians to believe the country can fund defense, infrastructure, housing, healthcare, and industrial expansion all at once. But BC is showing what happens when governments promise everything, control nothing, and assume taxpayers will quietly absorb every mistake.
That a government that is being told to whittle away at the deficit, to cut spending overall, still shows up with $4 billion in additional taxes.
The basic math is brutal. BC's operating expenses increased by around 40% over 5 years, while provincial revenues rose only about 18%. Capital spending climbed by roughly 130%. No household, business, or province can keep increasing expenses more than twice as fast as income and survive without consequences. Yet Victoria behaved as though borrowing could permanently replace economic growth and proper financial management.
You're a few weeks out now from it. Are you getting the reinforcement from the membership about, that was a D, if that?
Yes, our members are really concerned about what we're seeing in the BC economy. And we had the Premier on our stage, and the questions that I posed to him were really on the same vein, trying to get an understanding of what the plan is for the province to address this fiscal situation.
Taxpayer-supported debt is projected to reach approximately $190 billion. That is about 200% higher than it was 5 years earlier. This did not happen because British Columbia suddenly faced 3 wars, 2 pandemics, and an asteroid strike. It happened because the government repeatedly chose to expand spending without building the private sector economy needed to support it. These were political decisions, not unavoidable acts of nature.
Michelle, BC's baseline credit rating has been downgraded by Moody's ratings from AA1 to AA2. The International Credit Rating Agency cites a decline in the province's credit fundamentals due to high deficits and rising debt.
EB's government spent as though BC had unlimited credit. Ottawa watched and encouraged the same attitude nationally. Carney now inherits the result, but he cannot act like a shocked outsider. The federal government helped normalize giant deficits and weak accountability across Canada. Provincial leaders saw Ottawa borrow freely, announce massive programs, and avoid hard choices. BC simply followed the example and pushed it even further.
This year's budget forecasts a record deficit of $13.3 billion. But the Premier is defending the province's finances, with David Eby saying the NDP is investing in vital healthcare and infrastructure.
The province now resembles a family that went on an expensive holiday, charged everything to a credit card, and returned home to discover the income cannot cover the bill. Victoria's answer is not to cancel the next holiday. It is to apply for another credit card, raise taxes on everyone in the house, and promise that better days are coming. That is not leadership. It is financial denial.
What's the impact on driving people away, keeping their money out of this province, making people want to go elsewhere in order to work? What's the swirl of activity there that's likely to happen as a result of this happening?
Well, it's an economy that's already very weak.
The most dangerous part is no longer the size of the debt alone. Debt servicing has become BC's third largest spending category, behind only healthcare and education. The province is now spending more on servicing debt than it spends on social services. That means money collected from British Columbians is increasingly paying for yesterday's political promises instead of today's hospitals, schools, housing, and public safety.
With this budget, we had to make a decision. Were we going to, as the Conservatives suggested, make healthcare bear the brunt of cuts to be able to meet a credit rating?
Interest costs are growing faster than provincial revenue. That is a point where a serious fiscal problem can become a debt spiral. BC borrows money to cover deficits. That new debt creates more interest. The larger interest bill creates another budget gap. The government then borrows again. Eventually, the province is not borrowing to improve services or build infrastructure. It is borrowing simply to keep paying the cost of earlier borrowing.
Well, the BC Conservatives have been quick to criticize this, with interim leader Trevor Halford saying it's time for a budget that restores investor confidence.
Once a government enters that cycle, escaping becomes extremely painful. Taxes rise, services face cuts, investment falls, and economic growth weakens. Every new dollar of revenue is already claimed by old debt. BC loses the freedom to set its own priorities because lenders and interest costs begin setting them instead. That is why analysts say the province may have passed the fiscal tipping point.
And every additional dollar spent on interest is a dollar that's not being spent on healthcare, education, infrastructure, or tax relief.
The annual interest burden per British Columbian could rise from a long-term average of about $530 to approximately $1,500. That is money people will pay without receiving a new hospital bed, a new school, a new road, or better public service. It simply covers the cost of government borrowing. Residents will be taxed more heavily while watching an increasing share of their money disappear into interest payments.
To address this fiscal situation of skyrocketing deficits and debt, the cost of the borrowing for the debt is really, unsustainable.
Experts warn it could take 5 to 10 years for BC to escape this fiscal hole, assuming the government finally becomes serious. That is a very big assumption. Eby's government still appears more interested in defending the budget than admitting the scale of the problem. Ottawa is not offering discipline either. Carney keeps promoting new national spending plans, while one of Canada's key provinces is already struggling to finance existing commitments.
Finance Minister Brenda Bailey says despite the rating change, BC remains one of the highest rated Canadian provinces.
This is why Canada should be stunned. BC is a resource-rich province with ports, energy, mining, technology, agriculture, tourism, and access to Asian markets. It should not be approaching a fiscal crisis. The province was not robbed of every economic advantage. Its government mismanaged those advantages, expanded spending far beyond revenue, and failed to create enough growth to support the public sector it built.
I do not know one person that I come across hundreds of people in my week. I do not know one person who is happy with this budget. I mean, and we haven't even talked about outside of the business community. There's lots of people, seniors,
The blame belongs first to David Eby and the BC government, but it does not stop there. Ottawa created the wider political environment where deficits became normal and fiscal restraint became offensive. Mark Carney now faces the consequences of that culture. BC is not officially bankrupt, but it is losing control of its financial future, and both Victoria and Ottawa helped drive it there.
It is not a decision that I took lightly. And when I was sitting in the budget lockup, I was really spending a lot of time trying to parse the vision of the province. And I looked at the fiscal trajectory, $4 billion in new taxes. And then I was also comparing it with previous budgets. And last year and the year prior, we had given the BC budget a C-.
Eby's answer to this fiscal disaster is the same answer weak governments always reach for when they refuse to control spending: higher taxes. British Columbia is adding roughly $4.2 billion in new taxes over 3 years, even while growth is weak and businesses are already warning that the province is becoming harder to operate in. Victoria created the hole, and now families and employers are being told to fill it.
Question, you've got revenue and you've got expenditures. And so, I would not be surprised if this government is still in office in a few years down the road. That is the decision that they'll be forced to make, is increase taxes again in order to deal with the deficit and the debt.
The lowest provincial income tax rate is rising from 5.06% to 5.6%. That may look small on paper, but it lands on people already struggling with housing, groceries, fuel, insurance, and basic services. British Columbians are not paying more because their lives suddenly improved. They are paying more because the provincial government spent recklessly, failed to generate enough growth, and now needs another stream of money to keep the system running.
Well, it's an economy that's already very weak. The GDP growth for this year, or economic growth for this year, is expected to be about 1.3%. Just for your viewers, historically, the average pace of growth for the economy in BC is 2.5%. And even before the pandemic, it was a little lower, but 2.4%. So 2.5% is about the economy's cruising speed.
The government is also freezing inflation protection for tax brackets. That means a worker can receive a raise just to keep up with rising prices and still be pushed into a heavier tax burden. The person is not actually richer, but Victoria takes more anyway. It is a quiet tax increase hidden inside technical language, designed to collect more money without announcing a straightforward tax hike. The expansion of the provincial sales tax may be even more damaging because it targets services businesses need to build anything. Accounting, bookkeeping, engineering, and geoscience all become more expensive. These are not luxury services. They are essential to housing, mining, energy, manufacturing, infrastructure, and small businesses. BC says it wants more investment while raising the cost of every step needed to make investment happen.
I would say that it's threefold. One, overall business uncertainty, which is based on our economic situation, slowing growth, very limited private sector growth. Also, the uncertainty regards to Aboriginal land and title and property rights.
The contradiction is ridiculous. The government says it wants more homes, then makes construction planning more expensive. It says it wants critical minerals, then raises costs for engineering and geoscience. It says it wants LNG and major industrial projects, then adds another tax before companies even break ground. Victoria keeps placing more weight on the economy and then acts shocked when growth remains weak. The worst part is that these taxes still do not solve the problem. Even after collecting billions more from households and businesses, BC remains stuck with a deficit above $13 billion. That proves the province cannot tax its way out of this crisis. The spending gap is too large, and every new tax weakens the private sector activity needed to generate future revenue.
It's all going in the wrong direction. The cost of doing business increases thanks to the expansion of the PST, and we have not yet fully solved some of the other red tape and permitting delays and those kinds of things. And then you look at the fiscal trajectory.
Mark Carney in Ottawa should understand this, because the same mistake is being repeated nationally. Governments cannot keep raising costs on productive activity and expect capital to stay put. Businesses can delay projects, reduce hiring, or move elsewhere. Skilled workers can leave. Yet Ottawa keeps talking about making Canada competitive, while allowing provinces such as BC to make themselves less attractive.
Many people are wondering that, in order to be able to service this debt and to get us onto a more solid footing, are we going to be looking at future tax hikes?
The growth numbers make the situation even more dangerous. BC's economy is expected to grow by only around 1.2% to 1.3%, far below its historical pace of roughly 2.5%. The province is trying to carry record spending, massive debt, and rising interest costs with an economy moving at about half its normal speed. That math was never going to work. Weak growth means fewer private sector jobs, less business income, and weaker investment. It also means less revenue for the government. When an economy does not grow, a government has only three choices: raise taxes, cut services, or borrow more. EB has already chosen higher taxes and more borrowing, and both choices risk weakening growth even further.
He says the drop suggests the province is riskier for investors, which may force the government to pay higher interest rates, which ultimately may affect British Columbians.
The budget offers no serious plan to reverse this. There are small credits, long-term promises, and another round of talk about future projects, but nothing capable of restoring BC to its normal economic pace now. The province needs private investment immediately, yet its policies send the opposite signal. Higher costs, more uncertainty, and more taxes are coming. Private sector employment tells the same story. Since 2019, private sector growth has been weak, while public sector employment expanded dramatically. One estimate says private sector employment grew by about 6%, while public sector employment grew close to 40%. Another says roughly 80,000 public sector positions were added over 5 years, while private sector job creation remained essentially flat. The province is not facing this crisis because British Columbia lacks resources, talent, or opportunity. It is facing it because the BC government spent beyond sustainable revenue, discouraged private growth, and failed to control costs. Ottawa encouraged the same reckless model across Canada. Now BC is showing exactly where that road ends.